Welcome to the Steve and Cimino Says Boom Show, issue number 67.
Boom.
Hey everyone, welcome to Pop XP. And before the show starts, make sure to click that subscribe button and click the bell to get notifications when we go live and we upload awesome new content. And don't forget, if you can, make sure to share our stream on all your social media outlets. We appreciate it, and thanks for helping us grow the Pop XP channel.
Hello, welcome everybody to the Steve and Cimino Says Boom Show, issue number 67, and we are live. And for some reason, I feel like a talking head on Newsmax. You know, I got to keep everything straight. I got to keep everything proper. I don't know. But now, tell me what's going on, brother.
Well, we're ready to debate tonight, John. That's all I'm going to tell you. No, I'm excited, man. We're going to have a great show tonight. But remember, everyone, please look below, click that subscribe button, and smash that bell to get notifications so you know when we go live and we upload some great new episodes. And tonight, gentlemen, I'm excited. So I'm gonna hand it over to you, gentlemen.
Okay. First off, I gotta say, we got a special guest, and he was on recommendation by Roy Thomas. Roy said to me, hey, you should get this guy because he'd be a great interview and I would love to see it and I'd love to hear what he has to say. So lo and behold, we throw the little rascally Roy words out there, and sure enough, as Roy always does, we reel him in. But this guy, what this is interesting, Steve, now, is I love a guy that does big things in the world, right? Big things, and you don't expect them to be these big comic fans. And like, you know, they have some passions in the comic industry because, you know, it was always hush hush. You know, we don't say that, but you gotta, I mean, as we know, and as we've come to talk to many people and ourselves, we become a big deal because of the comics. But this guy, come on, the chief White House correspondent for Newsmax? I mean, come on. He's also a best-selling author who recently released Scalia, The Rise to Greatness, 1936 to 1986, which is a 2-volume biography of the late Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia. Steve, what do we have to talk about tonight's guest? Come on, tell me. Help.
Well, I must admit, you know, when I found out that we were going to be talking with James Rosen, I was taken aback because I used to watch James when he was on Fox many years ago, prior to 2017. And I was always taken aback by his professional demeanor and his knowledge base. And I really used to enjoy the way he would report. So to have him coming on our podcast and be talking about comics, there is a million questions I have, and it works perfectly with what you just said. People who do big things. And he was on TV on a national channel. The pressure must have been amazing. He's going live, he's doing big stuff. And then when he goes home, he's opening up comic books. So we are going to find out, and I am personally going to find out who, what, why, and when. This is going to be a good show.
Well, Niall, you think I can be a chief White House correspondent for Newsmax too? You think I can be there too? You think I got enough, or is it just too much?
I think you could be one of the best, John. You know, I think with your personality, your charisma,
well, I think probably
I
could be better because, you know, my accent is more understandable than that East Coast type thing that he has going. So I think that's probably the best way.
I don't know. Look, we're going to bring him out, but I don't know if we have to play the Star Spangled Banner right now or what. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. James Rosen.
Thank you, gentlemen. It is an honor to be with you guys.
Thank you, James.
I have to say, as a reporter, I've already detected a contradiction, which is something reporters love to uncover. The name of the podcast is Steve and Cimino Says Boom, right? So there are two things that are odd about this. Number one is that it omits the presence of Niall, and I'm not sure why, and I think he ought to be pursuing litigation. And secondly, the actual title is a misnomer because, as I just observed, it is not Cimino who says boom. In fact, it was Steve who said boom.
Well, okay, let's get it straight. Niall made up the title. Let's throw Niall out there. Let's throw him to the bridge. He made up the title. And you should know, James, Niall's a late bloomer to the show. He didn't jump on. He's like the Neil Peart of the band from Rush. He comes in after, I mean, obviously Rush, he came after the first album, but Niall was around, he comes in around episode 16. So he's always the new guy, but, and technically the most important guy, because we need him. Yeah.
I was the big ship on the ocean that picked up
no
the
Niall,
lifeboat,
no show.
Okay.
Whereas if it's, without Niall, nothing is going on.
Well, I know that it's you are all sort of a team of equals, and I'm honored to be with you. And, that was a very kind introduction. Just because I work in TV news doesn't mean I'm doing any bigger things in the world than any of you. Or, if any of us are, I've got two sons. If any of you are dads, that's the biggest job you can be doing, right? So in any case, thank you. And let's get to it.
Okay. First, James, I'd like to say that I was at Roy's for the past week, working on the farm, doing the Halloween party and having a good time with the man. And I looked on his desk, and sure enough, right there in his sanctuary, his study with all his magic in there, I look and I see your book, Scalia. I see that right there. And I said to Roy, I go, Roy, we're going to get James. He's going to do this. And maybe he can talk about his book and all that. And he was just like, yeah, he hasn't read it yet, but he's looking forward to it because the man has nothing but great things to say about you. And he says you're a wonderful writer. And he also says that obviously your love for Neal Adams, who I knew pretty well also, is very good. And once again, you got such perfect penmanship. Your emails, I've read them. They're beautiful. And all that stuff. But James, now throw this first. Let's go back. We know you do all this big stuff in the world, but we like to talk about the comics and the stuff that fanboys love and our passions. Let's go back to little James. Little James. When's the first time you see a comic book? When does it grab you? When do you love it? Like, tell us about your origins.
You're looking for the origin story, right? And that's not surprising in this group. So I was born in '68. So, I am not a first-generation Beatles fan, and I'm really not a first-generation Neal Adams fan, right? I come along later, and these were retrospective pursuits for me. The first comics I saw, all of those things were really introduced to me by my older brother, who's 5 years older than me. I distinctly remember some of the comic books he had lying around, and they were Neal covers. This would be around 1971. So one of them was the Superman cover where Superman is sort of before the gates of hell and the devil is beckoning him. And he had some of the Green Lantern, the famous Neal Adams, Denny O'Neil Green Lantern run as well. As I started to get into comics, the people who were drawing, and they were great draftsmen and professionals, I'm sure, people like Ernie Chua, Jim Aparo was still around by that time. And I could recognize the solidity of those contributors and their works. But once I got hooked on Neal, I like to say that he ruined comics for me because I could only accept Neal's work. And, it got to the point where as a young guy, like, you come to the ad in the comic book, and it would be an ad for the Treasury editions that DC was issuing around in the mid-'70s, Batman Treasury, Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer Treasury, and these others. Yeah. I would be spending my time looking at these tiny reproductions of those covers to see which ones were Neal before I even knew Neal's name. I could just tell the difference in his art, And I think the first time I got a look at Neal Adams, the first time I got to understand who he was or looked like, was the little photograph of him that appears in the inside back cover of Superman versus Muhammad Ali. And guess what? Right. He was good looking. It's like, wow, I want to grow up to look like that guy. And as I like to say now, Neal didn't look like the Marvs and Murrays and Mortys under whose crooked tyranny the whole comic book industry had labored for 30 years. He looked like a superhero. He looked like he could be Bruce Wayne to me. And his name itself was handsome with that A in Neal Adams. There's something very stately about his name. And then the signature itself was so dynamic with the double A's and the arrow underneath it and so on. And so this was pre-internet, of course. And it's been interesting for me to straddle the pre and post-internet worlds as a comics fan, because it was a very different business of collecting before the internet. You had to first find a store that sold comics. Then you had to ascertain whether that store sold back issues, right? And then you would, if they did, you would have to literally look through the back issues in these long cardboard boxes to see if there was one that appealed to you, right? It was complete, from the location of the store to the contents of the store, was all serendipitous or not. Today, you just go on eBay and you say Green Lantern, Green Arrow 76, and you'll be confronted with 200 choices, and it's just a matter of how much you're willing to pay and what kind of condition you want. As well, you also have the advent of, the CGC, and these price guides and so forth, which I don't like so much, frankly, because they take some of the, I guess, I don't know if the word is serendipity or mystery, but some of the just chance out of it. Everything is now quantified and rendered statistical, and it takes some of the experience that comic book lovers enjoyed for so many years out of it. Be all that as it may, my dad used to take me across the Verrazano Bridge from Staten Island to Brooklyn, which is where I was born, but I was raised on Staten Island. And Cimino, I can do the accent at will, right? Huh? What he's doing? He's just going dancing later. Huh? He's just looking to catch a beating later. Huh? Right? I heard Tommy's down on Father Capodanno Boulevard throwing out beatings. So anyway, my dad would drive me to a comic book store that he knew about somehow in Sheepshead Bay, Brooklyn, called Bill and Bob's Comics. And these were two older guys in this dusty place. And my dad would stand there and patiently chat with them. Probably had no interest in doing so, but he did it for me. As I was on my knees on the floor of that store, on the bottom sort of level, going through the long cardboard boxes, looking for Neal. And of course, it's part of the origin story of any Neal freak that you get once bitten, only once this happens to you, where you buy the thing. And my dad would say, you can spend $20, and each one was about $5 to $8, and I was like, gosh,
right.
The choices you're making, and you're bitten in the sense that you see a cover that is Neal and is striking and beautiful, and you're like, boom, getting it. You bring it home, you take off the tape very gingerly, and that's another thing is with that one time where you're trying to stick the book back in and you get tape on it and it rips the cover, and you're like, okay.
That's the worst.
But you discover that Neal did not do the interior artwork. Okay.
Oh yeah.
Oh, the betrayal. Bob Brown. I'm not. Irv Novick. And everybody else was just not Neal to me. Everybody else was maybe a good Neal imitator, like a Aparo at his finest, or or Irv Novick. And these were draftsmen. In retrospect, I recognize how great these guys were. But in any case, and then around 1994, I reached out to Neal for the first time. I should say this. My dad brought me to the 1976 New York Comic-Con, which I think was held at the Commodore Hotel. Mm-hmm. And they gave out a plastic bag there. I have one that had the Neal Adams the Superman running pose with the extended fist forward. And it was oddly colored in red, and it had the Mego Corporation. I knew Mego as the makers of those dolls. And
action figures, James. Action figures.
Figures, yes, you're absolutely correct. I squat corrected, and I see this guy, and he's behind one of the tables, and I was in 1976. I was not yet 8 in the summer of '76, and I said to him, "You're Carmine Infantino," and he goes, "That's right, kid." Okay, and somebody next to him, who in my mind was probably Dick Giordano, because in retrospect, that's who I had an image of, the guy with the mustache and the sort of droopy, longish, brownish hair. And he goes, "You know who I am, kid?" And I said, "No, I don't know who you are." And of course, Infantino took great delight that I didn't know the other guy. So I met Carmine Infantino,
Wow.
I reached out to Neal in 1994. I saw that he had been enlisted to draw a style guide for one of the Batman movies, and I thought, Neal Adams returns to Batman. That's a story. And I was freelancing at the time, and I tried to get it. I got a kill fee. It wasn't published, but I got paid by New York Magazine for writing that article. And gosh, around 1999 or 2000, they started putting out the slipcase editions of Neal's work for DC, the Batman volumes, the Green Lantern one, the Dead Man. And I reviewed them for the Washington Times. By that point, I'd moved to Washington and had begun my career as a Washington reporter. And I reviewed them, and I said that, I had sold that year. I sold my Neal comics collection through an eBay dealer. Why did I do that? A, I was getting married, and I didn't have the room in the house. And B, it was becoming clear to me that CD-ROMs were being produced that had everything he had done. And the slipcase editions were coming out. So, rather than having all this real estate devoted to the individual books, I might as well just be space efficient about this. And I was so crestfallen that those slipcase editions featured Neal redrawing and recoloring them in toto, redrawing them in substantial measure. And that struck me as a violation. And I wrote about it, and harshly. And Neal contacted me. He was, in Adamsian form, we'll say, and we had a very robust back and forth about this. But it put us back in touch. And, there was a point where he called me and asked me as a reporter for Fox News, would I place a call to Marvel's offices as a reporter and make an inquiry about the claims of Dave Cockrum for some kind of pension, similar to what Neal had done for the Superman creators, which I did. And Cliff Meth does not believe that this occurred, but it did occur. And Neal thereafter always credited me with being responsible for Marvel ponying up to assist Dave Cockrum in his final years. And we stayed in touch. In the year 2017, I was tapped to MC a big glitzy thing in Washington, black tie event at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce headquarters, which is an extraordinary grand room. And they were giving out an award. It was the second award. I had emceed the first award, which was given to Senator Orrin Hatch. And it was an award for champions of intellectual property rights. And the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, it was the Global Intellectual Property Center, which was a subunit of the Chamber of Commerce. And I said, well, I know next year who has to get this award. Okay, who fought for intellectual property and for creators' rights? And Neal was like, I don't do awards. I don't want to come down to Washington and do this award. And I said, Neal, you got to do this. You're going to do this. And I'm going to be the guy who presents you the award. So he and Marilyn took the train down. And I said, Neal, by the way, I don't want you showing up here in, your Tasmanian devil tie and your dark blue shirt. Okay, you got to wear a proper suit here. Okay, an actual suit. Like you maybe wore in 1964 when you were doing it. Okay, so he did.
Wow.
And then the makers, the organizers of the event were like, well, we want to see Mr. Adams's prepared remarks. So Neal sends me his typed speech in advance. And it is quasi-socialistic, okay? The people in the audience here are all major CEOs of major American capitalist companies, including people from Marvel, okay, and Disney, and so on. And Neal went off on work for hire and the evils of the industry. And I was like, Neal, the people at the Chamber of Commerce like, this will not fly. And I was like, Neal, you got to tone it down, And he refused. And, we won't have him if he doesn't tone it down. And I'm sort of trying to negotiate all and navigate all of this.
Oh, wow.
And he shows up on the night of the event. And I had prepared this thing. And the link is online. You can watch this online. My introduction of Neal. Unfortunately, the cameraman never widened out from the podium to show, because I was using a clicker and we had a big screen for some of the selected Neal images. But I went off, I told my Neal origin story, and I said how this man not only ruined comics for me, he ruined life for me, because in my eyes, everyone is either a Neal Adams creature or not. Either their features and their musculature show that refined Neal touch, or they don't. And I paused for comedic effect, and I said, of course, my wife is a Neal Adams creature. And I said, all of you here are Neal Adams creatures. And I explained that my collecting at this point is less on the comics, but I have begun collecting, and now I have an insane collection probably the only extant collection of mass consumer objects that are emblazoned with Nealiana. Okay, so I think I don't consider Neal just the greatest comic book artist of all time, which he was. I consider him one of the top 5 American artists of all time. Quick quiz for the hosts: who is the most successful American artist in history? And if we measure success, there are 2 ways to measure success for an artist: either in dollars earned during their lifetime, or in number of eyeballs that gazed upon their work. And the person who is the most successful American artist in history wins in both categories far and away. Who was that?
Charles Schultz.
Correct. Absolutely. Cimino says boom.
Ding, ding.
So, Charles Schultz's works are seen literally around the world and in space, and he was routinely pulling down $50 to $80 million a year in and year out. Okay. Neal Adams, unfortunately, never attained that kind of financial wealth, which I think he deserved. And I think his story is tinged with sadness in my eyes for that reason. But in terms of eyeballs gazed upon, I think he rivals Schultz and Warhol. And so I have collections of, I can show you some of this stuff, but shirts, I have about 100 different T-shirts from 1971 to the present. Pajama shirts, you name it, with Neal's works on them. Sand pails, watches, hats, gloves, paper plates, you name it. And in that introduction of Neal, I stated that you could live an entire week of your life just as you would any other week, getting out of bed, going through the motions of your day, and retiring at the end of the day, doing everything you would do in Neal Adams emblazoned objects, from the pillowcase and the bed sheets to your pajamas to the shower curtain to the towel.
Let me stop you for 1 second. I said this on the podcast. My first time I ever saw Neal Adams, I had, as a little kid, I had the bed sheet, and it had all the different heroes, but it had the Neal Adams Superman breaking the chain.
Yes.
That was the first time I ever saw him, so I saw
and
that.
it bothers me that why is there an Infantino's Batman and Robin next to Neal's Superman? How dare they? So anyway, and I said, of course, saner heads like my wife's prevail, and we do not live our lives in these. But I've collected all, children's slippers, and my people who know me think it's weird and almost quasi pedophilic that I would collect like a children's hoodie from 1975 with the Superman running. So anyway, Neal gets up there, and I said, ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, I said, my idolatry of this man is borders on the childish, and I know he finds me annoying, and I agree with him. I said, ladies and gentlemen, nefarious Neal Adams. And he gets up for this well-heeled Washington crowd, and he strides on stage, there's music playing, and I walk over this sort of lucite, award, and we pose for pictures, we shake hands, and I whisper in his ear, and you'll forgive the ribaldry in advance, but I said to him, don't burn the fucking place down, Neal, okay? And he gets up and he gave, to his credit, a watered down version of his speech.
Okay.
And then I got to hang out and have a cocktail with him in Maryland. And I was given to understand he doesn't drink. He did not drink very often, so that was special. Then around 2018, the next year, I started to interview Neal again by telephone. And we recorded, when you count the 1994 interview, over 20 hours of recorded interviews. And in preparation for this, I collected every single fanzine or interview in which Neal ever gave an interview. Okay. Wow. And I filled up, I had a lady who helped me organize this, like photocopying the interviews, getting them down to page size. And I have a binder this thick of Neal's interviews, spanning from the very first of them was a self-interview that was published in the back pages of, I think, Strange Adventures or Dead Man, one of those, and all the way through the 21st century. And this is someone who was interviewed prolifically. And yet all of those interviews only focused from the age of 19, when he starts doing Ben Casey, he turns pro and starts doing, I should say, the ad work for John Stone and Cushing and others. And forward. Nobody had really spent time interviewing Neal at length about his birth, his childhood, his adolescence, his relationships with his parents, his experiences with girls, and at the same time I was interviewing a lot of his I interviewed several of his family members and a number of his collaborators and people who worked with him at Johnstone and Cushing. And, there was an artist still alive, probably the only one from Johnstone and Cushing still alive. His name is Tom Sawyer. It used to be Tom Scheuer. He later became after being an illustrator at Johnstone and Cushing. And if you were to look at Tom Sawyer's work at Johnstone and Cushing, you would see a strong similarity to Neal Adams. He later became a showrunner and a scriptwriter for Murder, She Wrote. Tom told me about the time that Neal burst into the office at Johnstone and Cushing and announced that he'd lost his virginity. Neal disputed this, okay? But so I wanted to focus with Neal on the period from 0 to 19, and we took up 20 some odd hours. And of course, we fast forwarded at different times into his comics work. So all of that was preparation for a biography of Neal that I look forward to writing when I someday get done with Antonin Scalia. I took my sons to meet him at different Comic-Cons in Baltimore. I'll close out this rambling monologue with one anecdote. My son and I went to the Comic-Con in Baltimore in 2017 to meet up with Neal and to have breakfast with him and Marilyn before the Comic-Con. So we showed up at the Baltimore hotel where they were staying at around 7 a.m. and had breakfast with the two of them. And it was a buffet. And after breakfast, we walked the two of them over with their stuff and helped them set up. And so he loves kids. He always loved kids. And he was, more interested in what my son had to say than me. Look, Marilyn, he's interviewing me again, for God's sakes, So anyway, it was a buffet. We had our food, and we were nearing the end of the meal. And I like to eat. Neal likes to eat, And I had left on my plate one morsel of food, which was a little slice of sausage. You know where this is going. I sound like
I know Neal well. Yeah.
Where this is going, ladies and gentlemen, you've always known. So Neal, at one moment, just takes his fork, back-ended style, spears my piece of sausage, throws it into his mouth, chews it with delight, and winks at me like that.
James, I got something for you because I also knew Neal pretty well. And I always knew when Neal had a good day, he was in a great mood at the end of that convention. But here's something for you might not know. And his wife, he always hid it from his wife. Do you know what his favorite cheat food was? That he had a special thing that he used to do that his wife didn't like that he did, but he savored every morsel of it.
Judging from the looks of Neal, I think he had a harem of cheat foods, but
yeah.
I give up.
Okay, just so you know, maybe this could go in your book. He loved to take Frosted Flakes and put butter on the flake and eat it. That was his ultimate cheat that he shouldn't. And he used to tell me, my wife doesn't know it, but when he can get away with it, he would get sometimes those little boxes or whatever he could get, but he would want Frosted Flakes and he would put butter. He said sometimes he would use margarine. He goes, but butter was his absolute favorite on top of cornflakes. Frosted Flakes.
That is so horrifying that I just decided not to write the book.
Go ahead, Steve.
I feel like that would be time consuming with the little flakes and the butter,
Larry Hama told me about the chocolate donuts that he used to wolf down standing by the coffee machine at the first continuity office and so on. I'll tell you another funny story real quick. Larry Hama told me this. All the interviews, I ask a lot of the people the same questions, because I want the different responses to them. And I asked Larry Hama, was Neal considered a good-looking guy? Did he think of himself as a good-looking guy? And he said, yeah, no, Neal was a good-looking guy, but in his youth. But he said he had a certain look about him. He kind of exuded the look of an Irish New York cop. And he said, when we would work really late nights at Continuity in the 70s, 2 in the morning, 3 in the morning, we would want to take a break. There used to be diners in New York and coffee shops and hotel restaurants that were still open in those hours that you could go to. And we would go to this one place. And he said, all the hookers would clear out of the room immediately when they gazed upon Neal because they thought he was a cop.
Oh, go ahead, Steve.
First things first, James. It's I must admit I'm very enamored of your vernacular and cadence. It's absolutely magnificent.
Oh, thank you.
But
coming from a Brit, that is high praise.
But there is a crucial error in your entire life story there. I think you made a terrible mistake. You are telling me that you never read anything by John Buscema?
No, I was very aware of the other artists who were big, Romita, Buscema, like I was saying, Ernie Chua and Jim Aparo, and I could recognize the brilliance of these men, just as I can recognize the brilliance of the Who or Pink Floyd, but the Beatles are at the apex. It's just the way it is,
Mhm.
I interviewed Graham Nash once, and I asked him, it's a fanboy question, but I said, like, did you feel like I feel badly for every musician who existed in the time of the Beatles, because it must have been so cruel to not be one of the Beatles, just like I feel that way right now. I feel deprived and just eternally somewhat with a chip on my shoulder that I'm not a Beatle, still. And to have been one of those comic book artists in the time of Neal Adams. And if you read the interviews of Gil Kane, that bitterness towards Neal seeps out. He said dismissively about Neal once, Gil Kane did, that all he did was marry Stan Drake to Jack Kirby. As if that were some small feat. And Neal told me in our interviews about how the other artists at DC were importuned to draw like Neal, or if they weren't importuned, it was somehow made clear to them they needed to do so. And Paul Levitz, in his interview with me, denied that there was a house style. He said continuity had a house style. It's like DC, we had lots of different artists of different styles. And I think that's a fair point. But I asked Neal, did those guys like Irv Novick and Jim Aparo, did they ever come to you and express some bitterness or dismay that they were being forced to draw in your image in some way? He said to me, no, they expressed gratitude. They had families to feed. And if this was a way to do it, it's fine. They weren't proud about it, it seemed.
Well, it's quite amazing because basically, in many ways, if you transposed John Buscema's name for Neal, you have my story. For me, John Buscema is the finest comic artist who ever lived. And I didn't really read DC. So I wasn't aware very much of Neal's work until much later on. But
and you were in the UK, right?
Yes. Again, I was in the UK until 1991. So basically, through my formative years, I'm scripting and scraping. But I quickly realized early on that my eyes gravitated toward John Buscema first. It was always like, whenever John's doing something, I can do it. I'm curious because, and I also answer in some way. The art in the Kree-Skrull War in the Avengers, which features the beginning there, actually starts off with Sal Buscema, then it goes to Neal. But John Buscema basically finishes it with issue 97. Now, I don't know whether it's true, but John, it looked like he actually raised his game just a little bit for the issue 97. I don't know whether you've ever noticed it, because it is spectacular. And to see, Neal's work in 96 and John's in 97, when I look at that as a cross spectrum, that's the finest art that's ever been given a classic cosmic feel. I'm just wondering, what do you feel about that?
It's interesting. I grew up as a DC guy, and it wasn't until much later that I even realized that Neal had ever drawn for Marvel. I found the Marvel issues, whether it was X-Men or Avengers, difficult to get into, only because you had the sense of like entering a Netflix series midstream, and it was very difficult to sort of bone up, if you will, on the substance and make heads or tails of what was going on. Whereas the Batman and Green Lantern and Justice League stories and so on seemed to be more accessible because they tended to be more self-contained. But Neal's work for Marvel represents another of the pillars of that industry that needed to be taken down and that Neal Adams personally took down. And the story is told of how Stan Lee, seeing the revolution that Neal was ushering in at DC, decided he had to have, sort of like a CEO gets a load of, some new talent in a field and says, gotta have him, just gotta have him. So Stan invites Neal over to Marvel. Neal goes over there. I think this was goateed era Neal. And they sit down and Stan says to me, your style is more Marvel anyway. You should be drawing for us. And I gather they discussed page rates and that sort of thing. And finally, Stan says, which title do you want to draw? You guys probably know this story. And Neal says, what's your lowest selling title? Which is Cocky Neal. And Stan says, X-Men, we're going to cancel it in 6 issues. And he says, I'll draw X-Men, right? Neal wanted to show that if you're a good enough storyteller, you can take the most dismal selling title and breathe new life into it. And Stan said, okay, I'll let you do X-Men on one condition. And Neal says, what's that? And Stan Lee says that when you're done with your run on the X-Men, you'll do our most popular selling title. And Neal says, what's that? And he says, it's the Avengers. Deal. Then Stan says, what name do you want to use when you draw for us, Neal? And Neal said, my name is Neal Adams. And Stan said, oh, I know, but nobody uses their same name, their actual name, when they draw for both companies at the same time. And Neal said, you must not want me to draw for Marvel. And after that, that was the first time that anyone drew for both companies at the same time using their actual name. And believe it or not, as radical as that is, a change, it's one of the smaller changes that Neal wrought. I like to say about Neal that he is similar to the Beatles and Muhammad Ali, in that he not only revolutionized the product you beheld, but also the processes that put that product in your hands.
Mm-hmm. Good now.
Yeah. Well, first, before I get into my question, we got a super chat here from Bob Gable. Thank you, Bob. James Rosen is a real American journalist with integrity, sadly lacking these days. Thanks for this.
Thank you,
and
Bob.
200 Watt Studio. Thank you for the super chat. James, thanks for your dedication to real reporting.
Oh, that's kind. Thank you.
Now you've had an opportunity, like you said, people have reported on him from 19 and up, right? And throughout his career, but you were able to dive in with him into a point of getting very personal, right? Knowing things about him that he maybe hadn't shared up to that point. So getting to know Neal, having breakfast with him, having very personal conversations and different effects with him, I'd like to just talk to you a bit about, how were you feeling when the news came out that he passed?
Oh, believe it or not, it was Arlen Schumer who broke the news to me. There's something fitting about that. We had an intimation of Neal's looming mortality the year before when he had been hospitalized with sepsis. And when he turned 80, I wrote a celebratory essay about him for nationalreview.com, an odd setting for Neal Adams worship, but I don't think so. And he had just been on his Facebook page recounting how close to death he had come. Something like 40 to 60% of people who contract sepsis die from it. And in fact, Marilyn was presented with grim paperwork by the folks at the hospital. Miraculously, like a superhero, he recovered, but he didn't make it another year. And I was just stunned, and I wept. And as I had written in that essay almost a year earlier, this is someone who I have been idolizing since 1976. Okay, yeah. This is I can draw, and I've drawn professionally. I used to do caricatures at weddings and bar mitzvahs and sweet 16s, and I made $100 an hour. Why I ever left that, I don't know. Maybe because I got high from the fumes too often of the markers, and I also, as a consequence, have heard the song "Celebration" by Kool and the Gang more than any other living American. But I can't tell you how many hours I spent striving to make my work look like Neal's, and the inevitable disappointment of it. And I've read an interview with John Byrne where he still says to himself, sometimes I just look at my work and I think to myself, poor man's Neal. There was a book published, a tribute to Charles Schulz recently, which I reviewed for National Review magazine. And one of the contributors there spoke about her frustration in trying to replicate the Peanuts characters. It wasn't enough to do a good enough job. She wanted literally for it to look like it had been done by Schulz. And that, again, no matter how good you are, although Neal could do Mort Drucker better than Mort Drucker, and Neal could do Schulz and so on, so great was he. But still, it's sort of like in mathematical terms what they call an asymptote, where the curved line approaches the grid and cuts the world down in half to get to that grid, but it never quite reaches. You might get to the point where it's close enough and indistinguishable. But the frustration this woman felt as a young person because it didn't look just like Schulz, I felt that intensely. In any case, remind me of the question, Niall. I've gone on too long.
Yeah. How did, when you heard of the passing?
So his passing.
Of Neal,
So yeah, I mean, I wept, and I said in that essay that the thought of life without him, just my entire life, my entire sentient existence.
Yeah.
He was always out there as the best, the gold standard. And he was the best for me as a consumer, and he was the best for me as a wannabe practitioner. And the idea I said of life without him was saddening beyond conception. And I do feel existentially lonelier without him around.
Yeah, James, I mean, what you're saying is actually beautiful, because we all have, this is what we celebrate on our podcast, just like we all have that. The first time when we see those comics or those pages from that artist and the colors and the writing, it transforms us. It takes us onto another path. We don't know where we would be if without it. And it becomes that sweet song. It becomes that memory. Like, you can pick up any comic book and you can know exactly where you were at that time and where he was at that time. Like, and there's a lot of people out there, like, we all have our favorite artists and all that stuff, but like, obviously Neal's one of the titans. You know, he's on that. Everybody's a legend, they say now, but that's bullshit. There's this creme de la creme that we all know who they are, and even those artists that think they come, or writers that come close to that, no, they're really not. They came in the 90s. Give me a break. Anyways, but yeah, it's true. He had that moment. My just really quick, after my moment with Neal was seeing that remember, he did Captain Marvel in the calendar, in the DC calendar, but it was a sticker. Remember, it was they had it on.
I have it. It's in this office. Yes.
We'll see some of your stuff very soon. But that is the first, and I remember being really young. Obviously, the Superman was just a timeless picture, but when I remember seeing that Captain Marvel with the smile, and I remember saying, like, even as a kid, when I didn't know anything about fine art and all that stuff, you're just like, damn, that looks good. You know?
And let me ask you, John, didn't it strike you that there was a difference between Neal's Captain Marvel and the original C.C. Beck?
Oh, much better. Oh, much better. Because I know that's terrible to say, and Roy might throw something at me.
I probably, irritate people like David Spurlock, because there's someone who has this great reverence and has published a biography of Carmine Infantino, and I get Infantino's importance, but as an artist, when I would be in Bill and Bob's in 1978 on the floor in that comic book shop, and you have the checkerboard tops of the 60s DC comics, as you're getting toward the Neal era, again, just to look at comics before Neal, the musculature, there was no anatomy. Like, they would draw Batman. If you look at like Infantino, he would draw for the teeth like one line across, and like when Neal drew the teeth, they were like little teeth. They looked like teeth, and what would suffice for anatomy was a few stray lines. They made Batman look chunky, and like Superman looked like Wayne Boring Superman. He's got his pants up to here, and that's not a super. And Neal's famous quote, and I have not been able, by the way, to so consider this a crowdsourcing exercise right now for all those who are kind enough to tune in and to bear with me this long into this podcast. I've not been able to find where this quote first appeared or to whom Neal said it, but there's a famous quote attributed to him, which was, "If superheroes really existed, they would have to look the way that I draw them." Okay,
yeah,
that sounds conceited, but it's about as conceited as Muhammad Ali's assertion that he was the greatest, when in fact he was. And none of the superheroes, the window pane layout, the chunky anatomy, Bob Kane's faces and the sort of smiling Robins. Neal is such a quantum leap over all of that And so, your observation about seeing his Shazam and the difference it represented over the Shazams you had been acquainted with before then.
James, we like to say Captain Marvel. I know I must have said Shazam, but Captain Marvel.
Now, educate me on that. What is why is there a distinction?
Oh, because Captain Marvel is what he was originally called in the 1940s, but then in the 60s, when he lost the lawsuit with the Superman thing, he went dormant, and then the name came up, and then Stan Lee and the Marvel took the name Captain Marvel. So they had to. So when DC finally revived him in the 70s, they had to call him Shazam, but they had like the exclamation point because they could call him Captain Marvel in the comic book, but the name of the title had to be Shazam.
Interesting.
So and it stayed that way ever since.
It's an introduction to the seamier side of the business, or to the fact that every business has a seamy side, that you learn as you grow older and you pour more deeply into the industry and its history. How often it is studded with examples of larceny and litigation and very unsuperhero-like things.
It's a Shark Tank. Go ahead, Steve.
Working for Torpedo Comics, convention after convention after convention. And one of the main advantages of that was I got to see Neal a lot. And I would go and hang out with him. And the first time I met him, he made me howl with laughter because we shook hands. And he said, "You're a big galoot." And I hadn't heard galoot. It was like a 1940s type thing.
Yeah.
And I was like, galoot. And literally, I lost my composure. I said, I was laughing and laughing. The thing is that, and it's embarrassing to think about it now, but we began in our industry to take Neal for granted, that he was always going to be there. Mm. So after a while, I would hear other dealers and stuff saying, there's no point having a Neal Adams signature. He's at every show. He's doing all this signing. It's like, la, la, la. That didn't bother me. What I was amazed was he didn't really have anyone helping him at the end of the shows. And so he would be packing these boxes and putting them in. And I'm thinking to myself, that's Neal Adams. Surely some young kid, 19, can be there. Why is he lifting and humping boxes? And
I hear you. And I had the same sense of sadness following him and Marilyn around at that convention where they were setting up. To me, I felt, why is he even doing conventions? He's bigger than that, and the fact is he went back to conventions because, as it's been explained to me by people who are closer to the industry than I am, because of the economic crisis and the subloan prime crisis that took a hold in 2008 and which killed advertising for a while. To me, his story is tinged with sadness. And I asked him about this. And of course he disputed this, and his children dispute this, and they're better authorities on it than I am. But I still see his story with sadness because it's reputed, and I mean to get in touch with them to just get it in their own words, that people like Steven Spielberg and George Lucas were Neal Adams fans and borrowed from his extraordinary and singular inventory of imagery and presentation and storytelling for their great cinematic works. It makes sense to me that would be true. I do need to confirm it with them. And yet those guys became billionaires, and Neal was reduced to trekking around and setting up his own tables at conventions. And when I would ask him about this, he would say to me, James, it would be near Thanksgiving, and he'd say, I've got, all my kids and their kids coming over tonight. I consider myself one of the luckiest people in the world. I've gotten to do what I always wanted to do, and I've done it for my entire life. So he was more sanguine about it. But, if there were any justice in this frightful world of ours, a fellow like Neal Adams would have gotten rich. And I guess the other element of the sadness is that none of his characters or his creations for continuity ever took off. Now, should we ever have expected that an operation like Continuity would really somehow rival the operations of Marvel and DC? No. But his whole his whole claim, as he grew more disgruntled with Marvel and DC, and eventually there's that famous "Why I'm on Strike Against National" article in Inside Comics in 1974, was that if allowed to own the tools of production themselves, the artists could realize new heights. And once he had the tools of production, he owned the company, and he had the freedom to create whatever characters he wanted. They didn't take off, and I feel still some sadness for him in that.
Yeah, that's interesting. But the thing about Neal, he did like being at shows. I mean, I know there was some hard part, but not Neal. He liked the adulation. He liked to get that, and it felt good. And he was still, I mean, I know going to shows and all that stuff sometimes can be like a little rough, but when I saw him like when he was at his best and he was getting the right adulation and all that, he enjoyed that though. And he I know he liked that, because I remember one time when I was with him and he got some great adulation. He looked at me and he winked, he gave me the little spark and he winked, and it was like,
drawing is a solitary business, and Neal does like both interacting with people. Neal likes provoking people.
Oh yeah,
I keep talking about him in the present tense, so I can see where he might have enjoyed those conventions to some extent. And then, Jason, his son, talks about how people would slag, here's a British term for you, Steve, who would slag Neal off online, saying that he had been less than kind or what have you, when in fact, he maybe just had an off day, and this is the 10,000th signature that you've signed and hand that you've shaken and so on. And
right.
As creators go, yeah, he was far from reclusive. But, Dick Giordano's used to say, Neal's an artist. He's only happy when he's drawing.
And it was good in the later days of his life how he was always online on Facebook. Remember, he was he was doing teaching, and he was doing that. That was good. He didn't have to go out there. He was actually using social media.
I have to tell you, as a biographer, those nightly Facebook sessions of his, which would go on for a couple of hours, present me with a methodological dilemma, because they are the man speaking. Sometimes you're the man breaking into Sinatra songs and so on. And a biographer would be foolish to ignore that source of anecdotes and material from your subject. But it's a very daunting prospect to transcribe all of those sessions on Facebook. But at some point, I mean to do it. What you just heard, now I'm going to do my Howard Cosell. What you just heard, ladies and gentlemen, was the nighttime cleaning crew here at the Newsmax Washington offices. My apologies for that interruption of the noise.
No,
are we ready for show and tell? You ready?
Yeah,
before we do that,
Niall, I didn't mean to cut you off if you had a question.
Just before we do that, I just don't want to miss out on this. We got another super chat in from Aaron Sleeper. This is a good one, especially for those that have ever had their portfolio in front of Neal. I met Neal twice. First was at Heroes Con, and he excoriated my portfolio. Marilyn warned me. He ended it with, most of it looks like shit, but it's decent shit. I think you have some potential.
Yes.
That's good.
We got off easy, man. Neal was renowned for being brutal in his assessments of people's portfolios, and as he always said, the artists who came back to him a second time with improved material were the ones who maybe had a shot at being in the business. And of course, Frank Miller, I think, is the most famous of those.
Oh, one of his students, one of his pupils. Before you do the show and tell, really quick, did you ever get into anything else though? It was just straight Neal. It was straight Neal, and nothing Steve says John Buscema, or even you were more of a DC guy. Did anything kind of sway you like, hey, this is pretty good too, or it was just Neal?
So when Bill Sienkiewicz came along, it's like, to me, that's, Bill is a genius, okay? And we all see that today, and he's a multimedia genius, and his work is staggering. But in those early years, he was another of the Neal disciples, okay? And probably at that time, the most accomplished of them. So, I explored it with the same interest that I displayed toward the music of Jerry and the Pacemakers, okay? Or the other British invasion groups, we appreciate it for its similarity, to the root of the tree. Many years later, I took a look at, I think it's Brian Hitch, and he had a collaborator that he worked with, Kylar maybe. I can't remember the other fellow's name. And again, that seemed to me to be a kind of a modern style of art that took what Neal gave to the comics world and put another spin on it, but still imbued, still sort of was redolent of it to some extent. So I liked that work. I am a huge fan of Charles Schulz. I recently donated to the Charles Schulz Museum in Santa Rosa, California, 3 issues of a mimeograph 1964 fanzine about Peanuts. And the museum wrote to me to say that they have not seen any other fanzines like that from that time period. They were very grateful to have it. And I got a personal note from Jeannie Schulz, which meant a lot to me. I worshipped Gary Trudeau growing up. I loved Jules Pfeiffer, who was sort of a precursor to Trudeau, with the drawing of the same exact panel 4 times in a row, and the no thought balloon or word balloon, just a straight line from the words to the mouth, that sort of thing. And another of my artist idols that I revered was David Levine. Does anyone know who David Levine was?
No.
David Levine was the artist who drew for the New York Review of Books, but also his works were on the cover of Time magazine and so on. He had a very, he used a lot of cross-hatching. He was a caricature artist, and he used a lot of cross-hatching. He's famous for his Nixon works. His depiction of Lyndon Johnson became the most widely reprinted cartoon of the 1960s. It showed President Johnson lifting up his shirt to point to his appendectomy scar, which is a real-life famous photo of Johnson after he had surgery. And in David Levine's rendering, the scar was shaped like Vietnam. And if I showed you his artwork, you'd be like, oh, yeah, that guy. I enjoyed Jack Davis, and I actually sought out David Levine when I was 17 years old and had lunch with him. And my great shortcoming as an artist was I never learned anatomy properly. I could do some good swiping and so on, and I was very cognizant of the distinction that Neal always made between big shoe characters and little shoe characters. And he said, you won't be able to do little shoe characters well until you first master anatomy and can do little shoe characters. And I never mastered anatomy. And David Levine said to me, and there are David Levine imitators out there. David Levine said to me, you have to learn anatomy. And he said, he referenced the great French artist Daumier. And he said that Daumier used to actually have dolls in his studio. Not action figures, but dolls.
Okay.
Where he would be able to pose them in different poses so he could study how the different types of clothing with their different textures would wrinkle in different ways, the sleeves and so on. And so, in other words, you can't fake it, And so I was always relegated to the business of faking it, even as I became a professional caricature artist and did magazine work in my wannabe David Levine style. Did you ever show
Neal your stuff?
Yeah, in fact, one time.
What was your review?
So I drew Neal as he sat there live this would have been around 1999.
Okay.
I neglected to mention that I had Neal on Fox News a couple times. Like I actually brought Neal on Fox News once. I think it was once. And whenever they would let me anchor on that channel, I would bring in Neal Adams or Tom Wolfe or the people that I wanted. Not too many times you saw those kind of folks on cable news.
No, right.
So I drew Neal, and I tried to do it without a pencil, just with straight marker to paper, in the David Levine style. And I would say, the greatest artists, there is a 1-to-1 ratio between what they see in their mind, what they envision, and what they put down onto paper. Okay? And I'm sure even as late as the year he turned 80, Neal was still rendering in a 1-to-1 fashion. He really still had mad drawing skills at the end. My disappointment with his latter day works was that he made a conscious decision to eschew his hyper-realism of the 60s and 70s, which was so thrilling and so revolutionary, in favor of what I call a hyper-steroidal, much busier style. So that his Bruce Wayne now had the neck of the Hulk, and And Craig Boldman, who told me he's going to be tuning into this program, was someone that I corresponded with for the purposes of including his comments in the book. And he talked about how Neal in his latter days almost everyone is screaming at the camera. And he had this thing that he did. I'm not going to do it because I don't want anyone to take a still of this and circulate it. But Neal, for the last 25, 30 years of his career, was drawing every mouth with the upper lip curled in. This excessive grimace. But in my drawing work, the best I would ever do would be like an 85% of the sort of what I envision versus what I put down onto paper. And when I drew Neal on that occasion, it started out great. I was a little disappointed with the end, but I think he was somewhat impressed that I could just, without a pencil, put something down where, I respected the space. It wasn't like the feet are like down by the very edge of the paper, that sort of thing, So he saw the work, and let's just say probably he was charitable about it.
All right, let's show us some stuff. Show us here. Okay. Now,
go ahead. You wanted to say something? No, okay. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to, there's this right behind me, okay? Right. What is this, right? What is that? We all recognize the image from Action 419, 1972.
Right.
This is an enormous book with the cover reproduced, right? Wrong. Yeah. This is actually a secret hiding spot. Yes. And as all the aspiring burglars out there can see, I'm not actually hiding anything in it, so you don't need to break into my office. Okay. I've only seen one of those on eBay. I know it was mass produced. Okay. I'm going to leave you guys for 1 second.
Okay.
Here we go. Get out all the stuff. Right? It's insane. You're going to
Does the wife allow any of this stuff to be in the house, or it just has to be in your office?
You ask a pertinent question. Okay. All right. First, I want to just show some of the clothing items. All right.
Okay.
These are 1975 superhero athletic socks, sweat socks, we used to call them. Okay. Still with the wrapper.
Oh, wow.
So often you'll find like where they put Neal's art on the wrapper, but then used like Infantino or something over here, and it's just beyond offensive. Okay. Now, here is one of the aforementioned children's items. Look at that.
Great. That Superman is so legendary, though.
Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was used so widely. All right. Here is a collection of 7-Up bottle caps from 1979. There we are.
Oh, wow.
Right there, yeah.
Right? You just don't find these lying around every day, I'm going to say.
No.
Okay.
Wow.
Now, why do I collect this stuff? Besides the obvious neurosis that's at work.
Yeah, let me guess.
Do you want to guess?
No.
You're speaking rhetorically, right? Maybe the title of this podcast should be Steve and Cimino Speaks Rhetorically.
Yeah, right.
I collect them because these objects, which were mass-produced, Neal's work starts to be reproduced and licensed for mass-produced consumer items in 1971, right up through the present day. Here's a brand new T-shirt featuring his Aquaman, okay? Right? We see that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that was a sticker too, right? That was the sticker.
That was a sticker, but I think this comes from the calendar. Okay.
Yeah, right.
Now here's my Newsmax computer, my laptop from Newsmax, okay, on which I've placed one of those stickers from 1973. Okay. I just got a new phone case, but my phone case used to have an actual 1973 puffy sticker of like the Batman corner.
I have those.
Okay?
I have those.
And when I show that to anyone, and I've shown it to members of the United States Senate, I'm like, check it out. You want to see the puffy sticker from 1970? You want to touch it? Go ahead. Nobody fails to touch it. Senators are like, ooh, touching the puffy sticker. The reason I collect these mass-produced consumer objects is because they speak in a way that the comic books do not. The comic books circulated amongst comic book fans, okay? These objects speak to Neal's permeation into the broader culture.
Right,
okay?
Right.
There were people who were not necessarily comics fans who drank this 7-Up and were exposed to Neal's art as a result, etc. So anyway, let's just go through. There were certain things I wanted to show you tonight, and I couldn't put my hands on them. So these are just the things
I want to see the underwear.
read. All right, that's it. No, you know what? Here is a 1971 display, Superman display made of plastic. Okay, I've had this in every office I've had for the past 10 years or so. This costs about $400 on eBay about 7 or 8 years ago. Okay, you don't see too many of them come up for sale.
One of the best Superman covers too. That's a great cover.
Here's the thing. This actually has 1971 stamped on it. I have 3 or 4 mugs with the same Superman image that say 1971 on it. This actual image of Superman flying appeared on the cover of Superman 252, which had a June 72 publication date, which means it came out in April 72. So how and why was this Superman image, it says 1971 right here, being used for licensing in 1971, but did not appear in comics until 72? Ordinarily, the way it worked was an image appeared in the comics and then got licensed for use. I never have figured that out. And Paul Levitz, who's the last soul alive, who knows a lot about the licensing at DC in the 70s, had no answer for it. Okay.
I think I might have the answer. When they licensed, they might be licensing Superman, and they still use the same copyright, the same date, even though they use different images, because they did that with Ben Cooper costumes. It would still have an older date, even though they're using updated. It's just for the copyright.
I would see that in Peanuts all the time, where it would say copyright 1964, but you're looking at like a 1977 something.
Yeah, the same thing. It's actually the Superman, and they can use a different image. So the actual copyright, they got it in 71, and they're just using different images. So
my suspicion is that this particular image of Superman was lying around and licensed, and then repurposed for Superman 252, and that the other figures were drawn around it. We'll come back to this. Okay. This is just your run-of-the-mill foreign edition, but it's of interest because this, of course, is the cover from Batman 255 of 1974, which was the last of the great Neal Adams run on Batman in the 70s. And when it was published in the States by DC Comics, this incredible image was squeezed down to like this length, so that they could tease the other stories on the side. So it's nice that in this Mexican edition, El Hombre Murcielago, that they expand this image to what should have been its proper size.
Wow.
Okay.
Beautiful.
Here is one of the several pieces of Neal Adams' original artwork that I own. My crown jewel of original artwork, I'm not going to show on the show tonight because I'm saving it for the book someday. But I have a self-portrait that Neal drew in 1969 at a convention as a request that somebody out there who was a fan of my work in TV news sent to me for free.
Oh, wow.
And I brought it to show it to Neal at the last time I saw him in person, which was the 2019 Comic-Con in Baltimore, where I brought my younger son to meet him. And I said, what do you think about this? And because I didn't want to prejudice his response. And he stared at it and he said, somebody asked me to draw a self-portrait, and it matched the provenance that the donor provided to me when he gave it to me. So that is the crown jewel of my collection, one of the very few Neal Adams self-portraits from 1969. You won't be seeing that. However, here is a green arrow judging by the signature and the age of the paper, probably from 69 to 71, thereabouts, maybe 72. Perhaps 72, because that's around the time that run was going on of GLGA. I published this image in the issue of Alter Ego, thanks to the kindness of the great and legendary Roy Thomas, that he devoted to Neal Adams, I think 2 issues ago. By the way, on the back side of this, I see that I have the flyer that went out with the bottle caps.
Yeah.
Okay. Even rarer than the bottle caps is to see this flyer. Okay. How are we doing on time? We good?
Oh, we're good. You're good.
Okay.
Keep going.
Here is. Okay, these are two objects. I should take them out separately. I hope somebody's enjoying this somewhere. Okay, this is a transparency, large size, of the famous image from Batman 251.
Yeah.
And this is one of the most widely licensed images in the history of comics. One of the items I wanted to show tonight, but I couldn't put my hands on it readily, is I have a transparency like this of the cover of Batman 251. Look out, Gotham, the Joker's back in town. But where the writing that says, look out, Gotham, the Joker's back in town would be, there's a strip where the lettering was placed. That was empty, and I had Neal sign that for me, to James. Okay, here is, I probably shouldn't show this. I was planning on saving this for the book too, but it was on the back end of the transparency, and I thought it was going to ruin the image, so I'll just show it to you. This is an original convention sketch of Havoc. And again, from the signature, you can tell this is probably around 1969 when he was doing X-Men.
Just really quick, because that's a Roy Thomas, Neal Adams co-creation. And
Right.
Roy told me, I thought one of the ingenious things that Neal did, and he said Neal just came up with it, how he has the energy pulsating and you can always see it straight, even when he's sideways and all that. Genius. That was awesome.
It messed with three-dimensionality, that emblem. All right, we're coming to the end of show and tell. We're approaching the end of show and tell. This is like when Paul McCartney, at the Hollywood Bowl, this next number will have to be our last. Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Here is a 1978 chalkboard, okay, which has 3 Neal images on it. The famous 1972 Superman running pose. And again, why is this?
That's Infantino, though, right?
Doing it. What is that doing there? But here, those 2 Neal Adams headshots that were used.
That
in
Batman is
art,
awesome.
okay?
That headshot of Batman's awesome.
It's so simple,
Oh,
and it's so devastatingly effective.
so
And, was there ever a handsomer depiction than this Superman right here? Okay. This is even larger still.
well,
Here is my collection of Neal Adams refrigerator magnets. Okay. And my mother-in-law had them framed for me, which was very nice of her. Lorraine Durkin, who is not presently watching in Pittston, Pennsylvania. And you can see there's both Marvel and DC represented on here.
Wow.
You can see, if you see that Superman running pose there, that is actually a redrawn version of it. So frequently, Neal's iconic images were redrawn by anonymous hacks and licensed again. So that is not the actual Superman image right there, but that's 3-dimensional. This one right here. And the others are 2-dimensional.
I got something. Guys, keep going. I got something to show.
Uh-oh.
Okay.
I knew it would.
Since he didn't bring the underwear, we're about to get a surprise.
Yeah, I knew Cimino wouldn't take long to try and,
Here is a Comic-Con from 2011 with latter-day GL and GA depictions by Neal, signed by both Neal and Denny O'Neil,
Oh, wow.
whom I also interviewed for the book for about 4 hours. And Denny told me it's one of the best interviews he ever did. All right, here we go. Just a few more items. I don't care about the condition. If it's a rare enough object, the artifact matters.
There you go.
How many people use these drawing and scribble pads? Scribble pad. You don't have to just draw on it. If you just feel like scribbling, that's also allowed. How many people used these to render their own inadequate attempts at mimicking Neal?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, these are objects that I actually created because I've collected maybe 25 or 30 mugs from 1971 to the present that make use of Neal's works. But some of my favorite Neal works were never licensed out. And so I decided, I went on Walgreens.com and made these myself. These are Batman mugs with Neal's
rendering, great.
Right?
Wow, yes.
Okay, and here's from the earlier period, his Beatles rendering.
Yeah, it's a great cover.
This
Beautiful.
might be, if I had, terrorists forcing me to choose my favorite Neal Adams book, this might be it. Where Batman and the House of Mystery team up in Brave and Bold. And then there.
Oh,
There's several others of these mugs that I made. So I have one mug that just honors his horror work, that has some of his House of Mystery covers and stuff. I have one that just does miscellaneous, that's got like his poster for Justice for All means kids too, or whatever. All right. Don't think, by the way, that I'm not aware how neurotic I sound. Okay.
No.
Okay.
You're preaching to the choir here.
yeah, you and Cimino. Woo.
Another random 1975 children's shirt. And then last but not least, these are close to being the crown jewel, but I think the self-portrait from 1969 is the crown jewel. Here are my Ben Casey's. This is an original Ben Casey. Oh, I knew when I said I was going to hear gasps from you guys, and that's what I was looking for. But you can run your fingers on this right here, and you can feel the raised, sort of embossed, tactile sense to the cross hatching here, and to this spotting of blacks. Here's a second one.
Look at that.
Okay. Unfortunately, Christine Adams Stone informs me that she already has high quality scans of both of these, probably because I got these from Heritage Auctions. However, this one is a very rare, probably a unique Ben Casey piece, and I'll explain why. It's 3 panels, right? Except that on the back, there's an illustration, where, as you can see, somebody folded it over and used the end of Neal's work for a drawing of their own. This is not Neal. And I know it's not Neal, not only because it doesn't look anything like Neal, but because I showed it to Neal and he said it wasn't him. And he said something to the effect of, some bastard drew on my Ben Casey. All right.
That's a Neal Adams quote right there. Yeah.
So thank you for indulging all of that.
Well, I remember talking to Neal about, like, I asked him who did you like to draw the best? And he said, well, I always had fun with Batman. He goes, because it was always drawing 2 people at once. And he always considered the cape something like a different, because always flowing in there. He said, you drew them in. Uh-oh, look, I got him going.
It has to
you got to put.
It has to be done. Hang on. So I told Chris Adams once, Chris Adams Stone, that my favorite image of Batman of Neal that Neal did. So here's a very famous one that we didn't see in any of the. I have a children's flashlight that has this Batman on it. Now this is from October 1970.
Yeah.
Okay. The Ghost of the Killer Skies. I think it's Detective 404, and this was the first of Neal's images to be licensed widely, and to cause that kind of splash. And again, you see it redrawn sometimes in poor mimicry fashion and used. But my favorite Neal Adams depiction of Batman is this is the Encyclopedia of Comic Book Heroes by Michael Fleischer, Volume 1. I just learned about the lawsuit between Michael Fleischer and Harlan Ellison. I had no idea about that business.
Yes.
But anyway, for the entry on Batman in this Encyclopedia of Batman, published in 1976, which I had, it begins with this image of Batman. Yep. Okay. And I told Chris Adams Stone, first of all, I don't know where this comes from. The only place I've seen it used was corner box art on 3 consecutive issues of World's Finest in, I think, 72. Okay.
Look at that face. Awesome. Oh.
Okay. And I told Chris Adams Stone that this is my favorite of Neal's Batman renderings. And she reported back to me that when she told Neal this, Neal said that. And I said, well, why did he take that view of it? And she said, because Neal said, there's nothing going on with the cape. Yeah. And I said, but just this image and the fact that there's nothing going on with the cape imbues Batman with greater menace than an action pose would.
I agree.
And there's just something so perfect about this. But yeah, the cape was the other character. Man, I expect guys in white coats to just yank me out of here right now.
Well, they'll have to take all four of us because we're all the same.
That's
So
right.
in ending, we're going to have Steve. Any last words for Mr. Rosen?
You know, it has been an absolute pleasure. Your knowledge and, of course, the hyper intelligence that you obviously showcase is extraordinary.
Oh, that's very kind.
And also the love and the passion and the fact that you are going to be able to bring all of those powers to be to produce this book is a wonderful thing. And I just want to say it's been an honor to be a part of this show and hear your stories firsthand.
You're very kind, and I feel the same way. Thank you very much.
No?
Yeah. Well, we got one more super chat here. So I'm just going to pop it up from 200 Watt Studio. James, you have a YouTube channel to talk comic history. If not, you should. Thank you, 200 Watt.
I'm willing to entertain those offers, Steve. But no, I can barely keep myself in all my, this is just one of a few obsessions. I hate to say. I'm also a collector of Beatles rarities. So I have about 5,000. I sold to Northwestern University my collection of printed literature about the Beatles for about $75,000 a few years back. And that was an insane quest of trying to collect every single interview the Beatles ever did. And down to, for example, defunct British girls magazine romance comic books from the early 60s called Valentine and Marilyn and these other things. And they had every week, the Beatles answer your fan mail. And you could tell in most cases it was just Tony Barrow, their PR man, who coined the term Fab Four and wrote the liner notes for With the Beatles and so on, just churning out the answers. But you could tell occasionally he took a fan mail letter to John Lennon and got a very Lennonian sort of answer. That counted as, from where I was concerned, as interviews or publications by the Beatles under their own name. And I sold that collection, the printed literature, to Northwestern. I'm still sitting on my audio-visual collection, which is like 5,000 bootlegs.
Oh, my Lord.
And we're talking every single studio rehearsal session or scratchy demo that you can get your hands on, legally or otherwise. I have donated to the New York Public Library my collection of everything I could get my hands on that Tom Wolfe ever wrote, even in his Daily Deadline journalism phase of his career in the 50s and early 60s when he didn't always even get a byline. So, yeah, I've always been a collector. My wife attributes my collecting to a disorder. She thinks I'm a hoarder, basically. And of course, I like to say that any attribute of mine that my wife is not entirely enthralled with, she readily attributes to a disorder of one kind or another. But yeah, thank you. There is passion behind this, right? I backed when Neal died, and it's kind of still. Did Neal ever do this show, by the way? Forgive me for not knowing the answer to that.
No, we did a celebration of him, but we really didn't. Was Neal already gone by the time we started this?
Neal was gone. No, Neal was alive when you guys started the Steven Cimino Says Boom show. But he had passed probably when you guys
he was
were,
sick though. He was sick
4 or 5 months into the show. Billy and I tried getting him on a couple times. We had a couple. We went out to dinner with him at Baltimore. I don't know if it was 18 or 19. We did something with him, and we were going to have him on because we were also talking with him because he wanted to do crowdfunding. So we were going to help guide him in the crowdfunding arena for some of his own personal IP stuff he has. And we were going to get him on, but then he got sick the first time, right? And then he recovered, and then we were in talks with him again about getting him on. And then with their Facebook Live stuff they were doing and everything, it just didn't work. And then he got sick again. And then, I was in contact, and literally as I was setting up a follow-up email, I opened the web browser, and there's an article right there saying that Neal passed. And then Billy actually texted me right after that saying so-and-so told him that Neal passed. And so it was like, oh, geez, we just lost our opportunity there.
I want to just point out for all those who were kind enough to tune in, first of all, to thank you all. But if anyone would be interested in reading kind of a foretaste of what the Neal book will be like, you should go no further than Alter Ego issue number 181, which is of course the pro-zine put out by the legendary editor and Roy Thomas is very special for the following reason. He was a fan who became a chronicler in the early alter ego as an amateur chronicler. Then he became a practitioner, not just any practitioner, but the heir to Stan Lee and the creator of so much, just libraries full of characters and plots and so on. And then he also became a chronicler again. And in all the ways in which he has chronicled the industry, all the introductions that he writes and so on, and the continuing work on alter ego. So it's rare to see someone who is a practitioner who go from fan to pro to chronicler. And he's preeminent in all of those roles. I published in Alter Ego 181, which was devoted to the late Neal Adams, an article based on my interviews with him, in which I talk about Neal's childhood and his relationship to his father, which was not good. His father basically abandoned the Adams family, and Neal never saw him again after he was 19 years old. But it begins with the story of the first time that Neal Adams was paid to do artwork. And it was 10 years, when he was 10 years old, and he was in a bar in Brooklyn with his mom. So if anyone wants to see a little bit about how this book is going to take shape, that article would be a good way to go. And thank you all so much, the host, for your kindness, and everyone who tuned in.
Yeah, I have just two little things I want to show you. One, I want to tell you a little quick story. I don't know if you know, toward the end there, you know, Neal and Roy kind of always had a little tumultuous relationship. You got two geniuses. They had their visions, you know, both were equals in their field, and like sometimes they can clash. But here's a little something a little story that nobody really knows about, that I'm going to tell you something, and only me and Frank Miller actually saw it. We went to the Endgame premiere and in New York, and all the comic guys were there, and it was a special invitation, and me, Roy, and Dan went there. Carla, we were also with Carla Conway, Jerry Conway's ex-wife, that Roy is, that we're all still very close. And we were, after everybody foyered out, you know, they did a big thing and we foyered out, and it's funny because this was, they were still a little hot. It's funny, Neal and Roy would, you know, be cordial, shake each other's hand and all that stuff, but it was, you know, it was always, whatever. They had a little tension there, but they hadn't talked. They had a little meltdown in, online and stuff. They both wrote their things, and we're waiting there, and Roy went to the bathroom, and it's Dan Thomas and Carla Conway's next to me, and Frank Miller's right there, and Neal and Neal was going to the bathroom, and I said, oh, it'd be kind of interesting if, you know, I said, Roy's in the bathroom right now and Neal's going to go in there. So I thought it was kind of weird, and only me and Frank Miller saw that because he's waiting there for Neal. Literally right when Neal grabs the door and he's about to open it, out walks Roy. They like literally come, and only me, everybody all around us, but only me and Frank see this. And we're both kind of like, what is going to happen? They actually shake hands. Oh, hi. And they shook hands, and then they left. And that was the last meeting Neal Adams and Roy Thomas ever had with each other. And it was actually pretty good, but it was like in slow motion. It was like, oh my God, he's going to meet Roy in there. And Roy comes out, and it was just when he was going to hit the handle. But like I said, only me and Frank saw it. So they actually, in some funny way, going in and out of the laboratory, they shook hands. They had a little shake. Hey, hi. And it was like the last meeting. So Neal and Roy kind of ended on a semi-good term and all that. And I thought,
actually, in my conversations with Neal, he spoke scathingly about Roy, and I don't think I'll publish it. But I do have to say that I think both men, to the end, understood the contributions that each had made and respected them.
Yes, absolutely. And Roy's had some scathing things to say about Neal too. So, but okay.
What I had seen publicly was that Roy always took a kind of high road and endeavored to present his version of history, and would be gracious enough to say that he was aware that participants to different events always inevitably come away from those events with their own versions of them, and they sometimes clash, but here's mine. And I think he was very upfront about that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very interesting. Now, Niall, can you give me the big head? Because I want to show James this one. James, thank you for being on here. And so I have something that I think you're going to enjoy, because I do a special thing with Marvel, and I do an exclusive thing. And basically what I do is I do these prints that I have to get the licensings of his characters. And the thing is they're limited printed, and they only can be sold when a customer comes to the convention to see Roy, and you can only buy them there, and then he'll basically sign them. So I made this line of prints called the Roy Thomas Adamantium Edition prints, and I designed them, and they were all foiled enhanced and all that. They're direct from Marvel, but they can only be sold through me and only see at Roy at a show. And on my phase 2, I did this one right here, and it's all foiled enhanced. They're called Roy Thomas Adamantium prints, and it's signed by Roy. And what I'm going to do for you, because I know you're a big Neal fan, and I love this cover, and I just had to get it. I just had to make this a print. This is an exclusive print with Roy's signature. I'm going to mail this out to you. So at the end, you can frame it. It's beautifully the work they did on it too. It's like it's all foiled enhanced, adamantium enhanced, and all that stuff. But I think you'll enjoy it with Roy's signature. And I'm going to mail this out to you, so you can just send me your address and stuff. And so I want to send that to you.
That's very kind, and it is a really handsome piece. And I'm so looking forward to having it, to the point where I feel a little badly about this, but I'm going to do it anyway. And just point out to the viewers, as we discussed right before the show began, I'm just going to put it maybe in the form of a question. Does anyone else out there take a look at John's? Give him the big head again, if you would, please, Niall. Does anyone else take a look at this image and see between the hat and the curtain in the back and the general look of the room that John is in a mental hospital somewhere? Am I the only person? It's like a One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest type situation.
Yes.
He's at East Meadows Sanatorium.
You know, the man just offered to send me a beautiful gift, and this is how I thank him, right? I mean, what kind of person?
Don't forget the bow. Don't forget the bow.
That's part of the insanity look, right?
Yes. There. No one has ever quite worked out what the bow means, but
it's like, I don't know, maybe he's getting frequencies on there. I don't know.
And for some reason, it all worked, James. It all worked out.
You're a handsome man. Thank you so much. That's a very wonderful gift to receive. I'm grateful.
And thank you. We'd love to have you back. Everybody, James, Rosen, buy the new book. Right here, Scalia, The Rise to Greatness, 1936 to 1986. 2-volume set, but we're waiting for Neal Adams here. We're waiting for the Neal Adams one. Thank you very much. Steve, get us out of here with Mighty Mystic Millionaire.
Boom.
Hey everyone, thank you for joining us on Pop XP. If you haven't already, make sure to click that subscribe button and also click the bell for notifications when we go live and we upload some awesome new content. Also, don't forget to head on over to Twitter and follow us at the Pop XP and over on Instagram at the Pop XP. Thanks again everyone, and we'll see you soon.